Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation with Emii Alrai and Laurent Olivier. And the conversation topic for today is the archaeological memory. My name is Gavin Wade. I'm artist curator here at Eastside Projects. My pronouns are he and him. And I am a white man with a perfectly bald head, dark blue glasses, some dark blue black shirts and body warmer. And behind me, I have a background of framed artworks and books in our little library here at Eastside Projects. I'm going to be introducing our two speakers today, and great pleasure to have Emii Alrai here with us, who is the artist. We have an incredible exhibition here, the Courtship of Giants here in Eastside Projects, which we were very, very happy to be able to open up last week, and I've had a lot of visitors already. So thanks for all those who have come so far and who are looking forward to coming over the next couple of months. Emii has invited Laurent Olivier to come in conversation with her, and I'll say a little bit about Emii and Laurent, but just to inform that a sense of Emii has been in conversation with Laurent over the past couple of months out of an interest and inquiry into Laurent's writings and practice and work. And I think there has been a very interesting mutual interest and lots of conversations going on. So we thought this is something to share, and this is something to continue. So I will introduce our guests. So Emii Alrai is an artist based in Leeds, focusing on the ancient mythologies from the Middle East alongside personal oral histories of Iraq. Emii weaves together narratives by forging artifacts and visualizing residues of cultural collision. Drawing references from objects in museum collections, ancient writing from the Middle East, and cultural memories, her work questions the value and origins of artifacts, as well as navigating the experiences of diaspora. Laurent Olivier is Curator-in-Chief of the Celtic and Gallic Department at the National Museum of Archaeology in Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France. And I will here just again apologize to everyone for my terrible pronunciation of some of the words that I'm about to have a go at. He's Professor of National Antiquities at the École du Louvre and reader in the history and theory of archaeology at the École Pratique de Hautes Études. He received his PhD in archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and Olivier has authored over 200 scientific papers and book chapters. His recent publications include The Dark Abyss of Time, Memory and Archaeology, which is translated by Arthur Greenspan, 2011 book. And there's many other books, but I'm not going to try and pronounce some of those titles because they really are beyond my ability to even have a go. And I'm sure you're going to find out more anyway. So I will be handing now over to Emii, and I will join in when, if need be, which probably won't be. And then we will welcome questions from everyone. So if you want to drop questions into the chat, or take a look at those later on in about 35-40 minutes time. All right, so over to you both. Thanks very much, Emii and Laurent.
Hello. Okay. Has that worked? Hi, Laurent. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. I guess we're quite interested in just seeing how me and Laurent have been in conversation for probably around maybe more than a couple of months now. We've been having sort of like weekly calls and just discussing a lot of the themes that sort of go through Laurent's book, which has been very formative to the work that I've been making over the last 2 years, The Dark Abyss of Time, which can we just shout out to, because what a great title, The Dark Abyss of Time, amazing. There's like lots of kind of correlations between I think Laurent's work around memory and archaeology specifically, in terms of how we think about objects of the past, which I think is really interesting in terms of like my material practice at the moment, and kind of the show that's just opened at Eastside, the Courtship of Giants. I guess I don't know whether I should just. I'm Emii. Hello. I didn't do my. I'm a brown woman with long, like black hair. I'm wearing a blue jumper. Behind me is a shelf of books, and I'm wearing like a gold necklace. And I'm an artist normally based in Leeds, and my pronouns are she and her. Laurent, I don't know whether I should just hand over to you to introduce yourself a little bit too.
Yes, I apologize in advance about my poor French accent in English. So I'm Laurent Olivier, and I'm an archaeologist. I look like a guy who is already a bit old. You know, I'm losing a bit my hair. My color is not white; it's light pink or a bit like orange, and I'm wearing a green jumper. And I got very interested in Emi's work because it may sound bizarre, but I deeply believe that we are doing the same thing, her and me, Emii and I. In fact, we are exploring memory. And in my case, I don't know about Emii, but in my case, it has begun when I was 10 years old. I was in a woodland. I was playing with my friends, and suddenly I was hit by something like thunder. I just discovered that, you know, in the ground there are remains of the past, and the past is not remote. It's just at all feet. You know, you just have to look down, and it's there. And what is there? It could be fossils of billions of years. It could be pieces of flint from the prehistoric age. It could be pieces of shards or pipes, which are already just 1 century old. But all the past is in the ground, and it's something which is amazing, in the sense that, in fact, we may be directly in touch with the past. We may directly touch the past. And in what Emii is doing, she's working with materiality. And this is what archaeology is about. Archaeology is not about the past in itself. It is the past inside the present.
Okay, that's been muted. Yeah, carry on, Laurent.
Yeah. And so I made another discovery when I was quite a bit older. When I was writing my PhD at Cambridge, I discovered that we have a problem with time, because we used to consider the past in terms of centuries, in terms of period. You know, we imagine the Roman time, for instance, the 16th century, the prehistoric age, you say the ice age, but all of that doesn't mean anything, since there's a thing remains. You know, you say remains in English. They remain. We say reste, and rester, it means staying. Stay with me, reste avec moi. Those rest, they remain, they stay. And so the thing of the past has disappeared. You know, the cavemen or the cave people, because there was also cave women, of course, they have disappeared. But what they have done is still there. And we can touch them. We can take them in our hand. So it means that in a way, the Ice Age is not over. The Ice Age is still continuing to exist. And so archaeology is not about the past. Archaeology is about memory, about how the remains, by remaining, by staying with us, you know, are still building memory, are still constructing a memory by themselves. They are still acting. They are still acting on us. And so it is at that point that I think that Emii and I, we are close to each other, because, and Emii would talk about that far better than me, but we are, I don't know how to find the word, we are acted, we are walked by the past, by things which have happened centuries or generations before us, but it's their way to remain alive by being transformed by being changed, by being reinterpreted by us. And so it's pointless to look for the truth of the past. The past is only accessible, from the present, since there is no other place than the present for the past. Since the past is what materially remains. And when you realize that, suddenly you have a huge field which is widening, which is opening in the front of you. You see? And this is where that I think that archaeology as a scientific discipline, there is no such a big difference with art, with what Emii is doing. She's also an archaeologist of herself, of her own memory, and she's also a researcher. She's looking for something. She's doing research.
I think definitely, I think between our practices since we've been speaking, some of the really interesting conversations that we've had have been around this idea of material memory and the kind of relationship of archaeology to I guess where I sort of first started reading your book, Dark Abyss of Time, it was really around thinking about museum practices in the West specifically, and how we're really obsessed with holding on to these memories or these objects in a very kind of static way. So a lot of the work that I've sort of been making has really dealt with the Western Museum and modes of display, particularly focusing on armature, and actually how the armature itself acts as a quite a violent device in terms of literally bringing up an object to your eyesight in a museum, an object that we might not have the best kind of provenance for, that we might not know exactly where it comes from. At the same time, it might be from different types of digs all over the world, but then brought together in one showcase. So all of these objects already are starting to lose their own meaning and interpretation through the way that the museum displays them. And I think what was really interesting was one quote that I really loved from the book, which I'll just read out, is one where you say for the reliquary to retain its identity, you have to transform it, deform it, and in the end destroy it. And I really loved that, because I think that when we think about the objects of every day and the things that we use and the things that are tangible within our own surroundings, we are constantly using them, and we're constantly touching them, and they're constantly in this sort of mode of degradation, and things are sort of made to be used and then destroyed, I guess. And I think it's really interesting that within an archaeological context, or within a museological context as well, that what we are doing, instead of letting these objects that we excavate from the ground, which is also a process of destruction through the actual I guess the what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my goodness, I feel like the word is the comment dit métier, in English, the study of archaeology.
The discipline, for instance.
That's it. The discipline. The discipline of archaeology, is actually a really violent process, because by digging through the ground, you're cutting through all these different levels of strata that also have ecological bearings. They have all of these histories still aligned. You saw so many different layers of sediment to get to this one object that might already be part of the past detritus. So what older civilizations would have thrown away, the Costa Cup of today, And I think it's just really really interesting, this idea of in order to retain the identity of an object, an archaeological object, that we have to use it, and to put it into a museum context where these objects are then stuttered and are removed from their environment or their grave sites, but also their terms of use, is super intriguing to me, because I think it stops you from being able to have this engagement of I feel like, Laurent, what you always term as the intimate relationship with objects, and how that actually removes a lot of the histories that we kind of like physically feel towards these objects, or like the way that maybe we carry like ancestral patterns within our own like subconscious or our own DNA that like want us to use these things that are like removed from us. And I think that kind of enters into a process of like, you know, especially objects, like in my case, like I deal with a lot of objects from you know, the ancient Middle East specifically, because that's sort of where my heritage is, and looking at those collections and seeing how those are displayed in museum contexts, how they are kind of grave sites actually, even though the way that we access museums is about you know, being present and like being face to face with history, but actually what you are face to face with are objects that no longer have function. And I think there's a lot of tension in that. And yeah, I think it'd be really nice to hear about, like, I feel when you talk about the intimate it's really, I think there's something in that that I'm really interested in exploring.
Yes, but you know, we used to think about our relationship with object, but we don't used to think about the relationships, excuse me, of object with us. What do the object do? And in fact, they do something. And regarding the intimate, you know, when my mother died, it's a long time ago, she gave me a box, which is a kind of treasure box, but I think that there is one in each family. You probably have something like that, Emii, yourself. It's a box it's a box made by women and transmitted from a woman to another woman. So we are two boys. I'm the older one. I got the box. Also, I'm not a girl. And in this box, you know, they put old rings. They put intimate things. You know, glasses. They put personal items. And my mother put also, you know, the little things that we had been doing in primary school, you know, gifts for mothers. But my brother and I did when we were maybe 4 or 5, you know. And she put also, I found that very funny. She put also, you know, the teeth, some of the teeth we had lost when we were little kids. And so I wondered, what can I do with this box? If I put this box in a corner of my house, and if I just left it as it is, I'm going to kill this box. And in this box, it's easy to see that you had artifacts for many generations, maybe 7 or 8 generations. There was even pieces of 18th or 17th century. There was a very old cross, you know, that people used to wear. And so I realized that, in fact, if I want this box to be alive, I have to put other things in it, you know. So I have also to put things of my kids when they were little, you know. And in this way, I keep the box alive, but anyway, I'm changing the composition of the assemblage, we say in archaeology. I'm transforming its content, you know. And there are things that are going to disappear, for instance. For instance, in the box, there is a very old cigar that has never been smoked, and it is falling into pieces. It is going to disappear. But this is the destiny of the box. And what we used to forget about archaeology is that everything we found are pieces of intimacy. You know, the vessels which are exposed in museum, they were you know, there was a vessel in which people used to eat, you know, you used to drink. It was in the cupboard, you know, behind the table. It was a universe of intimacy. And this intimacy, you know, is lost, and it is transforming into pieces of discourse in the museum. You know, what was the pot of the house is transformed into a witness of the Hellenistic civilization, you know, or something like that. And it's a discourse about history, which is put at the place of something which is related to the intimate. But what is important, they do things because they are intimate. They talk to us, they touch us, they move us, because they have something to do about intimacy. And if not, they are nothing. They are just pieces of junk, you know? And it is true, and as a museum person, I have to avoid that. It is true that putting things into museum, it's a way to, I don't know how to find the word. It's a way to terminate them, you know, to terminate their first life as intimate artifacts. And what we do, yourself and myself, in fact, we are trying to find again this intimacy or this intimate relationship with things, in fact.
Sure.
And this is absolutely what you're doing in your work, in your pieces of art.
I think it's so interesting what you're saying about that, like this removal of intimacy, like and how that kind of, I feel when you put a kind of glass over it and like this object just ceases to be able to like live its life outwards. And actually I think this obsession that I think that we have around permanence that like is very much perpetuated again and again within the cycles of museums. Like I worked in museums for years as well, like as an assistant registrar, so I was doing that while making a practice, which is really funny because I feel like being an assistant registrar, like I had to be very specific. I'd really look after these objects and be really into the conservation of them for like the kind of longer like life of them for the museum for future generations, which is really like embedded within the Western Museum, like the preservation of history. But then at the same time, like in the studio, like I feel my practice is so chaotic where it's like things are supposed to break, things are supposed to diminish completely. Like when we were installing the exhibition at Eastside, you know, we built one of the sculptures and then like as we were putting it onto the armature, it snapped and it was like, well, okay, well it snapped then, like that's fine, like we'll allow it to just take its course. And actually like allowing things to break and to like disintegrate, I think is quite interesting in terms of like thinking about like archaeology and like thinking about like the kind of closer relationship that we have with degradation as well. Like it's really important for things to kind of go through the cycle of like breakage because they have more histories in them through use or through touch. And I guess like when we were discussing last time around this idea of like the removal of the sensory and like how I think when we kind of approach objects within a museological context, we are so stripped from these kind of sensory elements of them. Like a lot of objects would have had a lot of ritual use attached to them too, and a lot of like community like procession around them. So there's this book by Yanis Hamelakis called Archaeology and the Senses, where he talks about this very specific bust of a Grecian statue that was found. It was like, I can't remember exactly where it was, but it's a place in Greece where like a community had a very, very, very like strong relationship with this object, and they would bring it offerings of manure. And that was something that was like really like integrated within that community and had happened for years and years and years and years. But when, you know, somebody from the British Museum came over to this place and saw this like, you know, artifact that like, you know, was so linked to like the kind of Hellenistic period and the way that is another conversation of how the Roman period, the Greek period is so like valued and like really like on top of a hierarchy of what is like Western like beginnings and like civilization. And it's, you know, it's really like another conversation really. But just for this curator, Yanis Hamelakis talks about how his reaction to seeing this object in use, which actually had a lot more signification to the community itself, being offered like literal poop, was horrendous for him. And he was like, this is so awful, like this is really bad for the object, like we're going to take this away. And what happened is the head got taken back to the British Museum, where I think it still is today. I think that's what he says in the book. But I find this like relationship so like, you know, it kind of like really seems in together, like this idea of like empire within the museum, within this idea of like removal of senses and like just like total not really seeing or listening to like what people wanted from their objects, like that. What happens then in that gouge that is created when that object then no longer exists within that community? So, you know, for that community there, like it was really important for them to like give those offerings, and then suddenly that is taken away and you're told that it's wrong. I think there's quite a lot of like discourse around this idea of like the sensory. So I guess like in relation to maybe like the exhibition, it's quite I really wanted to make something that was sensory. So like this idea of like using materials in a specific way to elicit something that like you want to touch, or like there's a lot of like hay and a lot of straw like in the space as well. So like there was this kind of really like in certain areas, like the smell of hay, like this kind of reminder of like a sensory relationship to a material or to an object. But then also there was a fire. So like there's now apparently like a very faint smell of barbecue, which I love. Like, you know, like all these kind of elements that like kind of imbue more of like a kind of history to these objects is really interesting. But yeah, I think this idea of like the sensory, but like trying to situate that through falsity, making these objects that like are like fake copies of things that like have been said to be like, you know, mammoth or like, you know, important or deemed valuable by the West, and how those are kind of displayed. I guess I'm kind of interested in those kind of tensions. Yeah.
But you know, in this example that you gave about this statue in Greece, you can see how something which seems to be so obvious for us, I mean, the past being in the past, the statue belonging to the Hellenistic time. In fact, it is very artificial. It is creating something that doesn't work, because, in fact, the statue was still alive in that present. She was still acting. She was still doing something, and put into a museum. This is another piece of sculpture added to a thousand one. And so what I think very interesting, it's that question of time, which is obviously wrong. This idea that, you know, the past is in the past. In fact, the past is in the present. And when you're digging, and it reminds me your exhibition, when you're digging, in fact, you're not digging just in the ground to find interesting piece. You're finding directly into the materiality of the past. You're entering into the past. And so the materiality of the past is not specifically the remains that you find, but also it is everything which is wrapping the remains. I mean the sediment, the earth. And this is something which touched me a lot in your work. It's that you're including that in your installation. It is not just about object, but, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it's object inside something. And this inside, it's the materiality of memory. It is sand, it is a sediment, it is hay, grass, it is all the living things in fact, which make our world alive. And so what is alive in our world, when you look at the present, when you look at it in terms of materiality, there is a contradiction between what we think is the present. We used to think that the present is just what is happening now. We are talking to each other, this is the present. But if you look at the place in which we are talking, you and I, this is not the place of the present. This is all the things of the past which are remaining in this present. And so the books behind you, the fresco behind me, it's much older than us. And so the present is the present of this past in a way. And so if you begin to think like that, if you try to think what it means, materiality, again, it is putting upside down our conception about time. And it's there where archaeology and art are able to create philosophy in a way, you see?
I think it's really interesting because I think also in your book you talk about this sentence that is like, there is so much past that we have no room for our present. And I think that there's something around this idea of us not necessarily dealing with what it means to like exist within the past, because we always put the past into these very like specific vessels of time. Like we don't allow it to like live within like the everyday. And I think that kind of we don't really allow ourselves to like grieve for the past or like to engage the past into like use. And I think that's kind of what I got from that like sentence, this idea of like, I think within like objects as well, like we, you know, we find them, we take them out of the ground, but for what? Like, why are we doing that? Apart from obviously, yeah, they're amazing and they teach us a lot about like kind of previous ways, but like actually like none of those like objects like mean really anything without like any narrative attached to them. And I think that it's like there's not the use, or there's not this kind of like bodily reaction to these objects anymore that we're allowed to have through just like the way that like we've like collected things. And I think, you know, you were talking about this idea of like the sediment and like the like how memories are kind of like sedimentary, and that's why we have reactions to being in specific spaces. So like the way your body reacts to being in like a natural site is very different to how your body reacts to being in like a cityscape, for example. But like at the same time, like your body still like finds attachment to like certain types of brick or certain types of dust or certain types of texture, because it might like hone back to something that is like much older than like the body that we like possess. It might be something that is like it comes through this kind of like history or lineage, which I find really interesting. And like that relationship to like use of like your environment and use of your environment. And yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense really, but like I kind of, what was interesting, I think when we spoke earlier, we were talking about Ursula Le Guin, which is that I'm like really late onto this like text, the carrier bag theory of fiction, and she kind of situates how like man's or like humans' greatest invention like is the container. And she's talking about the fact that instead of like thinking about the bag that we had to put things into, and like that kind of symbolized like, you know, us being like living off the land and like moving in ways where, you know, we had a lot of time, and we'd basically be like more concerned about like feeding ourselves and like using the environment around us. But she kind of then like relates that to how what we've sort of like valued instead is like this ascent of like man the hero. So like who the people who went off to like hunt mammoth, even though we didn't need to eat the meat because of the kind of climate that we were living into, but like they would sort of do that to like get the story, and then the story is then like relayed, and then the hero then kind of grows like as this like idol or this you know tale. And actually like through like the process of like, I guess maybe I'm thinking of it in museums because lol classic, but like thinking about how this idea of like the hero or these like objects which are heroic that need to be like salvaged and like removed then are like taken into these like spaces where they're exalted on plinths and exalted on these modes of display, but actually like not really in reference at all to like, you know, she says this really nice line where she's like, nobody's talking about the container for the things contained. And I thought that was really interesting, and where she talks about like, you know, we're sort of sick of like the story of like the ascent of man the hero, but like actually like what about like the story of like the earth itself, and like what that has to tell us about all of these different types of histories and the things that we value in terms of like, yeah, I guess like narratives or oral histories. And yeah, I don't know, I guess like maybe like within this idea of like containment, like building the maze was something that was quite interesting in terms of, oh, it was like draft, it was really hard, but like this idea of like being in something that contains you, and then like weaving a kind of pattern, like this labyrinth, this sort of maze of like finding things through texture. Like a lot of like the expanses of the material are just so textural through plaster and through sand and through like natural materials. But then it's like to then it's almost like the sculptures almost like situate themselves as maybe more important than like the texture of like the landscape that is created within the exhibition context. But actually like maybe, I don't know, like maybe the sculptures aren't like that important in the kind of grander scheme of like thinking about how we like rethink like material hierarchies.
But you know, I think there is a deep paradox about the remains, and this paradox makes them very, very fascinating for us. On one hand, they are still there. They are materially there. You can touch them, you can handle them, you can find them. But on the other hand, they are mute. the people who were using them, the people that were believing or loving them, they have disappeared forever. So it's bizarre, it's weird. You have something which is here, but which doesn't exist anymore. And so, you know, this kind of empty containers is used very often as a witness to tell a story, to reconstruct a story. And in this way, it is very interesting to see how museums, you know, mobilize with objects, you know, to create, to invent an history of civilization, which is basically what museums are about. You said the hero, or man, or mankind. It is a history of progress, which is taught. A history which is false, of course, because you have other civilization in the world that have never enjoyed a similar history to the European history. Since the European history, in fact, it looks very based on this idea of progress. You have the cave people, then you have the Neolithics, they are inventing agriculture, then they are inventing metallurgy, and then you have the Roman and the Greek civilization, and then you have the Christianity, and then you have the modern time and industry, etc. But if you look at the history of Australia, for instance, there is not such a process like that with the Aborigines, you know. Or even if you look at the history of Africa, it doesn't work like that. Or even Oceania, or America, it doesn't work like that. And so you see how there is a connection between the history of Europe and the way the past is exposed. And it's very much linked to the history of the economic and cultural domination of Europe over the world. In other words, colonization. You know, it's a way to take the past and to take it for yourself. You know, and to use it as an element of discourse. And so it's why it's very important to have an idea of what is the history of archaeology, you know, how it has been working and what it is about and so on, because you are able to see that there are other stories possible. And precisely, this is this idea that if remains are remaining, they are acting on us. They are touching us, you know, and when you were talking about the physical connection with object, it's precisely about that. An excavation is a physical experience, and being with the artifact is also a physical experience. It's both physical and mental and psychological and intellectual, and it's like art. Art is exactly about that. The connection of what you are doing with matter and how it is creating ideas, you see? And I believe this is what you are exploring yourself in your work.
I think what was like really interesting also like was this idea we spoke about quite a while ago, but also there's so many things I want to like note back on, because I feel like, you know, what you're talking about like this like Eurocentric way of like disseminating the past and like this kind of violence of that. And then I think how that sort of like it's still perpetuated in the way that like we even handle our bodies within a museological context. Like we're not allowed to be loud, we're not allowed to be sensory, we're not allowed to question, because, you know, as you were saying earlier, like we go there as a place to be taught, like it's not a place where we have conversations. And I think that obviously there is a lot of work that is being done to counteract that within the museological world, but like, you know, those infected bones that like make up those institutions like are still there, like, and that is just so related to like empire basically. And I just feel like I don't know how that will fix itself apart from like allowing like objects to maybe like not be within that sort of way, or like for them to sort of erode in some sort of way. I'm not saying that we need to like break the cases and like crush everything, but like, you know, but also like maybe, I don't know, that could be cool, but maybe not, I don't know. But yeah, I think like I think this idea, I think that we spoke about quite early on in our conversations around like memory palaces as well, and like how people would like really remember things in the past. I think you were saying about medieval poets, was it? Before you had like pen and paper, and then like or before you could like really remember things, if you were like illiterate, was like you would build these kind of memory palaces, like where you would remember all these like massive stanzas of things, and then you'd kind of walk around it, which is really interesting, because I was like, wow, it's like a maze actually. Like it's quite interesting in that way, that like I think that kind of narrative of like mazes also being related to like the way that we kind of process like memory, or also like time, and the way that we sort of situate the past and the present and the future, like as things that are very static, in the way that we have like, I guess at post-enlightenment, have like thought about the history of time and it being like very rational, but actually like it really doesn't function like that. Like there's, I think, a lot more in tune with like maybe the medieval times, or like pre that even, of how different kind of notions of time worked, and the way that it's so integrated with like the past is always so integrated within a present and a future. And I think that's really interesting in how we situate memory too. I don't know, I feel like that made no sense whatsoever. Sorry, everyone. But yeah.
Yes, it does. But it's coming from your own work, and I was very struck when I saw that in fact you are building rooms, monumental rooms containing things, and as your work is about memory, you know, it reminds me of there's a, I don't know what is the word in English, memory palaces of memory.
Memory palaces, yeah. Memory
palaces, and this is exactly this idea that in order to be able to remember a huge amount of data, the best thing to do is to imagine them contained into a place. This idea that the past is a place, and that memory is contained into a room. And so you imagine, for instance, a palace, of course, with different rooms, and in the different rooms there are different things, and those things can be organized in different sub things, you know, in each corner of the room, and it is the best way to. It was used in the Middle Age, you know, when people had to know by heart thousands of lines of poems, which is of course impossible. And so the best thing to remember is to invent such a memory palace. And I think that what you're doing, it's somehow your own memory palaces.
I think in some way, like trying to find that, but also like I think there's like this idea of a memory palace, but then also this idea of like, I think within the installation is that it's also like a falsified memory. Like there's none of it that actually exists, or it might be rooted within any kind of real narrative or real structure. Like a lot of the things are like totally like loric, like they're like totally mythologized. But then I'm kind of interested in this idea of playing with like, I guess, that narrative, and like how you can like read into something that could be like construed as like this might be related directly to like memory, but like actually it's like, I don't know, is it, or is it just like a material exploration that might allow you to like add memories of your own, or like a relationship with the sensory that might like take out something of like a past feeling, or a past like relationship with a certain type of material or texture or scent that like takes you to place like your own histories within things, which I think is like maybe this kind of relationship that we are not allowed to have with archaeology in a way, because it's so taught back to us in a way that it's like, this is what this is, and it's like, but how do we know? Like we literally don't know this. Like we can like get all of these scientific facts about, you know, what kind of sherd it was, or where it was found and what it might have been used for, but we will never know, like because we don't have those stories. And I think it's just really interesting in terms of like the oral history. I just like flipped back through some of my notes, and there was something, I think, when we were kind of talking like earlier about like this idea of like when we preserve things, we seem to only preserve like the kind of main areas. You were talking about medieval villages, I think, or where you only preserve like a certain part of like a city that's like really beautiful and very like aesthetic, but then actually like all around that area will not have the same kind of care or like the same kind of conservation that happens. And actually, like you were talking about how around the kind of areas of like conservation, like things are allowed to collapse. And I found that quite interesting too, like what happens around the sites of like excavation, like why is, I don't know.
The thing what we have to think about is that if you think in archaeological terms, the whole landscape is archaeological. Everything is archaeological, you know, everywhere. But something very new is happening now. It is what we call the Anthropocene. This is the ability of our industries, you know, to destroy the living environment on a scale which has never been reached before. And what is killed is not only nature; it's also the places where human can live. And when you do an urban project, you know, in fact, what you do, you arrive with machines and you're destroying all the memory which is contained into the ground, and you're not building any new memory. And I think we are at a moment where this question of material memory, of the memory which is contained into our environment is absolutely crucial, you know. And it is true that was a small islet of a wonderfully preserved, I don't know, medieval city, or I don't know, or a Romanesque church, a medieval castle. When you look around, everything is destroyed, you know, on large scale. And so preservation, you know, it's like a coin, you know. Preservation is a face of a process on which you find destruction on the other one. We are living in a time of destruction. Anthropocene is the age of destruction. And so we have to think about that, because we have not only to think, if the past is contained into the present, you know, the present address also the question of the future. And the future, in terms of archaeology, is what is going to be our material impact onto the world. And you see that with, I don't know, with disaster like Chernobyl or Fukushima, you see that the impact that we are going to have on our environment is going to last for millennia, or even thousands of millennia. And this is archaeological, you know. We are creating an imprint on our material environment, which is archaeological. So we have also, this is what you said just at the beginning, en passant, as we say in French. But in fact, it's a way to think the present, the past, and the future all together, not separated from each other. And this is precisely what a piece of art addresses as a question, because it's that, a piece of art.
I think I just want to join in, just because we've got only about 7 minutes left. So if anyone does have questions, to drop in. But already there's such great big ideas in terms of looking into reality. In a way, I'm really interested in that proposition that you have mapped out about time requiring transformation, that energy has to be altered some way for time to function. And it made me think about whether that understanding of, so you have to deal with time, you have to do something, and it has to be transformative. But you've been talking about a lot of not very sensitive ways of transforming. So is the opposite of that, I was wondering, is it about empathy? So that if you understand a situation, can there be a museum in the future that works in a very different way and is all about empathy and a contextualizing, an understanding of that, but triggering it? It will always change it, but is there a better way to change it, I guess, was my thought.
Definitely. Like, I think like that's the sort of, I think having more empathy within that kind of context, like, is so important. And I think it's like, I think they're just, I don't know. I mean, like, do you know what I mean? Like, I don't have the answers for this, and like, it's something that I'm like figuring out as somebody who's worked in like both museums, and like, I like, as much as I like criticize them, like I also love museums a lot, and I think it's like thinking about how we like just like pose histories as maybe like theatrical in some ways, or maybe the ways in which we've like learned about them in the past has been almost like akin to theater. But like, absolutely, like I think the most important thing is to like really think about what is lost from the histories of museums at the moment, which is oral histories and oral narratives. And I think that you find empathy within those because people know how to use those objects, and people know how to like, or like have stories around them. And I think that that is actually way more important and more valuable than the object itself. Like, objects are things of beauty, and they can be things of like, you know, they hold so many different elements, and they are important, but like they are just nothing without their stories. And I think that that's where you find empathy, and I think that that is where like the future of museums needs to like head, is like more of like oral recollection. And like, I know a lot of museums are trying to do a lot of work around this as well, so I'm not being like they're not doing that, but yeah, I don't know, that's my hot take. I don't know if that answered your question, Gav, sorry.
Yeah, I just thought that I was sort of thinking, it made me think about releasing carbon, you know, an action, you dig up peat, or you dig up the ground, or you burn something and it releases carbon, in the way that it made me think of the way you release time. And so I just thought it's about that technique and approach to releasing time. There is like, you have to do it, but there are so many ways, and lots of them. Actually, there's a question in here about nostalgia. And I was wondering, is nostalgia a way of describing an approach to thinking about time? Is it a block on actual transformation, or is it, you know, where does nostalgia fit within that sense of archaeology?
Laurent.
I think that's one for Laurent. Yeah,
that's one for Laurent.
That's one for me. I'm not sure nostalgia is a good feeling. Nostalgia is I don't know if it has the same meaning in French and in English, but nostalgia is about to have regrets about the past, and it's also to create somehow an ideal idea of the past. What I do prefer is this idea that the past is fictitious. It's fictitious because it has only sense through us. And we are finding a meaning into the past, and each generation is adding new meaning to the past. And so in this way, the past is active. It seems to be very abstract, what I'm talking about, but I'm just thinking about the story of the Roman conquest, for instance, and how it has been approached since the 19th century. In the 19th century, at the time of the empire of Napoleon III, it was seen in a very positive way. The Gauls were defeated, they entered into civilization, and it was a positive process. And France was doing the same in Algeria. You know, we were teaching civilization to savage people, and it was for good. But then, when we had this war with Germany, the first one, a part of France was taken and attached to Germany, and suddenly people began to realize that, you know, a war of invasion is not so great, and maybe the Roman conquest was not such a positive thing. And when the First World War occurred, it became clear that the Gallic warriors were fighting to defend their freedom against an invader, and so the meaning of the past is changing all over the period of the times. Yeah. When we had this fascist regime, the Vichy regime, you know, which was a regime based on the collaboration with the Nazi, they tried to say, okay, we are at the same point in 1940, what we were in at the time of the Roman conquest. We are defeated. We have to accept we are defeated, and we are going to enter into a new European civilization, and so on. Yeah. And 5 years later, in 1944, the partisans, it was obvious that they were fighting on the side of Vercingetorix. And today, Vercingetorix, you know, after the wars of decolonization, Vercingetorix is a bit like Che Guevara. He is a guerrillero. He's making guerrilla against an imperial power. So I mean that in that sense, you see that the past is always changing, but in a way it is completely fictitious because the way we see it is not as it was, and it's beyond our reach. But at the same time, we are finding some element of truth in the past, something which is true for us at least.
I think can I just pop a line on just on nostalgia back and then because I realize it's like now too. But I think that there's this really nice quote by Mahmoud Darwish in his book Absent Presence, where he talks about like nostalgia being like an expert gardener, and like it chooses what to forget and what to grow, and then that actually you never are nostalgic for like when you're never nostalgic for like the bad things that ever happened. So you never see like the broken window when you recollect the past, or when you like think about those things. Like you always see like that's it's like the expert gardener in that way, that it's just like no, we're gonna forget this. We don't want to look at the weeds. Like even though the weeds and like the crack in the window is like really important to like narrating like that kind of history. But I don't know. I just wanted to whack in a bit of Mahmoud Darwish because shout out to him. But like
and there's actually a question in here just about providing perhaps a reading list of some of those points that have been mentioned, which would be great to share with people who are here. But we do need to wrap it up, much as I think you have made an amazing example of this sort of live conversation that is coming around your practice, even both of your practices and the way that they relate. And I really thank you so much for sharing what I think is a really powerful understanding of why, when you talk about fiction, you know, the history being fiction, I think that's such a powerful positive statement, because what it reveals is that the creative act is part of what makes reality and what makes now. And so it's always this battle for including, making sure that how we exhibit, how we imagine and how we create stories is what reality actually is for us. So thank you for both your contributions, amazing. And I know there's more questions in here, but I think we're going to wrap up, and there are lots of books to read and exhibitions to come and visit. So please do both of those. Thank you so much, Emii and Laurent.
You're welcome.
Everyone for coming.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye guys.